Welcome to Act in Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts, producer and host. On this episode, we'll first be talking about Kanye West and his new album, Jesus is King. Since the release of Kanye's explicitly Christian record, he's dominated cultural conversation and continues to surprise people with his increasingly conservative opinions, addressing everything from the importance of communities to local churches to sustainability, and even in a recent interview condemning abortion. On this segment, Andrew T. Walker from the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission joins me to take a look at Kanye's music and cultural influence. Then on the second segment, Bulgarian economist Stefan Kolev explains the importance of Wilhelm Röpke, the 20th century German economist, and explains how Röpke's thoughts on community are still applicable even in our digital age. As always, I've linked relevant articles, books, and videos in the show notes for this episode, and you can read those at blog.acton.org. Also, if you like this podcast and you would like to help us reach even more listeners, you can do that by leaving us a rating and review on the Apple Podcast app. Today, I am talking with Andrew T. Walker on Kanye West and his new album, Jesus is King. Andrew is the Director of Research and a Senior Fellow in Christian Ethics at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Caroline. It's good to be with you.
So Kanye's newest album, Jesus is King, dropped on October 25, and there's been a lot of talk about this album because it obviously represents a departure from his previous projects and has topped the charts since its release, even outselling his previous album, Ye. Andrew, what were your expectations for the album? Did it meet them, exceed them? Tell us about that.
Sure, and I would say to begin with, it far exceeded my expectations. When I first became familiar with the narrative that Kanye West had converted to Christianity, I think a lot of us sometimes are aware of kind of celebrity conversion narratives, and put forward a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of reluctance, kind of figuring out, what's the nature of the conversion, what type of Christianity are they going to espouse, and I think that reluctance can be both justified and problematic, depending on how you're harboring that skepticism or reluctance. But I think with what we've seen with Kanye West, everything looks to be profoundly authentic. And when I was highly anticipating the album, and honestly, just shocked. I wasn't sure if I would expect kind of moral therapeutic deism type Christianity, where God is there to basically make us feel good and he's a mascot for our hopes and desires. But the Jesus is King album from start to finish is filled with lyrics that are provocative, they're informed, it's pushing back against both the culture, and it is even, and I'm really shocked at this, the song Hands On directly kind of confronts the Christian skepticism that Kanye West knows that his conversion is going to be met with in the Christian community. And he's basically saying, I understand the reluctance, but instead of doubting me, why don't you pray for me? And so it's breathtaking what we have seen so far in the album, but also in additionally to his public comments with various interviews, which I'm sure we'll maybe talk about.
Now, you wrote a few articles, one article in particular on Kanye's conversion and kind of his public persona in the culture for ERLC. Did you listen to or follow Kanye beforehand?
I did. Yeah, I'm a music connoisseur. I would say something I'm pretty passionate about. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in hip-hop or an expert in Kanye West's music, but I have been following his career for well over a decade and have found him to be an incredible artist, someone who is who's cut from a different mold and is an independent thinker, and so have just been really intrigued by him, perhaps less as an entertainer and musician and more as an artist, because I think he really does embody creativity and novelty in one person. I think he's a truly unique figure in kind of the American entertainment, musician, artistic lanes for sure.
And he's unique in more ways than one, obviously, because he is so countercultural at the moment. And before we started recording here, you even compared some of his thinking to a combination of Chesterton, Wendell Berry, and Wilhelm Röpke. Can you parse that out a little bit for me? How in the
Sure.
world are you drawing parallels between what Kanye is saying in his interviews and those three huge thinkers?
Sure. So in a lot of various interviews, Kanye West is espousing a very deeply communitarian social conservatism. I mean, in this interview he does with Zane Lowe on Beats One, he specifically calls for the local church to be at the center of a culture. He's talking about the need for sustainability. He's as I said, he's talking in economic and social and cultural categories of Wilhelm Röpke, Wendell Berry, G.K. Chesterton. He's very much thinking in kind of this permanent things strand. And this is seen also in comments he's made as late. I recall seeing over the weekend, he made comments about abortion even. And so there's some type of social vision that has been in tune with his artistry as well. And so I would really encourage everyone to not just dial into the album, but to see what he's saying in these interviews, because he's offering candid thoughts and not holding back at all what his convictions are. I was really shocked. I'm only 40 minutes into this Zane Lowe interview on Beats One. It's a 2-hour interview, but I mean, he is sounding like a complementarian in his biblical anthropology. He's talking about the need to, protect women's innocence and children's innocence. He says that during the recording of Jesus as King, he was asking people to pray and fast. And he said that he was warning people that if he found out that they were having premarital sex, that they would be banned from helping out with the album. So if you're looking for kind of ethical renovation following someone's conversion, there's at least initial fruit being borne out in Kanye West's witness right now.
I would imagine that a lot of the people in Kanye's circles and the people that he's worked with in the past are just racking their heads at the moment, being like, what is going on? And saying to themselves, well, Kanye has said some pretty nutty things in the past, but man, like, what is he doing now? So can you speak to kind of the reactions to Kanye's conversion, kind of from both sides?
Sure. So I think on the one hand, you're going to have some Christians who, again, might be justified in some of their skepticism just because of kind of celebrity profiles and conversions. So I think that's justified on the one hand. But as a lot of people have pointed out on social media, it's not necessarily right to have a default posture of skepticism. When someone is seen converting in the New Testament, the first default instinct is not to be skeptical. It's to rejoice. And so while people are going to hold that reluctance or skepticism in the back of their head, I think the first instinct that Christians need to cultivate is joy and thanksgiving at what God has done in the heart and mind and life of Kanye West. Now, if you look at it from a different angle, from a more progressive category, I think you would have to have extreme disappointment because Kanye West, if he continues down the lane that he is continuing, will be saying things that a lot of cultural progressives and secular progressives will object to. And we're seeing this on comments he's made about abortion, about political correctness, about who to vote for and why he's going to vote. You can definitely tell that he is one of these kind of cultural wrecking ball type figures because he's so renowned and powerful and iconic in the culture that there's a sense of carelessness that he has when he carries himself, that he just genuinely does not care about the opinions of his fellow peers. And so I really do think, depending on where this goes in the long term, he has the ability and a unique ability to upend a lot of the default settled convictions of cultural progressivism, just by virtue of introducing in categories of, I mean, if you go back and read the lyrics of Jesus is King, as someone pointed out on Twitter, I mean, he's a cultural reactionary in the lyrics. He's talking about the need to pray with your family, the need to protect his wife and children.
Oh, was that Sarab Amari who pointed that out?
Yes, it was Sarab. Yes, he's a good friend of mine. And he's talking about the need to, I said, pray with your family, to put down Instagram, and to basically put forth restraints on your life, which is the very opposite of what cultural progressivism would tell you. So again, I really do think that because of his sense of uniqueness, and I mean, he's kind of a daredevil in a sense as well, that I'm going to be really following kind of progressivism's reaction to Kanye West, because he's not safely in their box anymore. And if I were someone on the far cultural left, I would be very threatened by what Kanye West is saying, because someone with his cultural power has the ability to influence the conversation in a way that would not be favorable to cultural progressives.
Well, let's talk about how his voice could be used, because, I mean, I do think that there is a danger of looking to celebrities, or really just any public figure in general, to look for sort of a cultural redemption, I guess you could say.
Right.
Because, the mission of the Christian is to share the good news of the gospel. It's not first and foremost to change culture. But at the same time, I think that we can rejoice that Kanye is interjecting this departure from relativism into the mainstream. So where's the line between that, between realizing that I don't really think that we should look to Kanye or someone converting in general as a way of saying, oh, hurrah, we're going to change the culture, but just saying, or at least just being thankful that God is using this huge public figure to spread his name and give God glory. So where do you draw that line?
I think you've answered it helpfully somewhat yourself. But one thing I would add is I think while we can celebrate what seems to be a definite positive shift in Kanye West, I, at the same time, and I say this as a warning particularly to myself, is I don't want to make a young Christian and a young Christian celebrity kind of a mascot for a cause. So one of my cautions right now to everyone in the Christian community is to kind of back off on Kanye West, let him do what he thinks God is calling him to do. And it's evident in some of the remarks, he doesn't see himself as primarily changing the culture. He said this in this interview I've listened to. He views that his calling now is to share the gospel. And I think what you said is correct. Transformed cultures begin with transformed consciences.
Exactly.
So we should hope that Kanye West does what Kanye West is the best at, which is disrupting culture through sincere innovation, and see what happens as a result of that, and not require him. I mean, my fear would be that kind of the Christian machine incorporated, so to speak, would now try to have him at the conferences and make him a Christian celebrity of sorts. I think we need to give him time to just be a Christian, to be hopefully discipled by strong Christians around him, and to let him cultivate the proper instincts. I mean, Paul warns against in the New Testament about new believers effectively being given too much too soon and being puffed up with pride. And I think there's an admonition in this situation as well. So I think the Christian community just needs to restrain itself towards him, and also not try to find social validation in the fact that someone of immense cultural power is one of them, because Christians are always, it seems to me, having an inferiority complex about not being welcome in the culture. Now that Kanye West is a Christian, the temptation is to think we're now the ones in charge. And I don't think that's the right instinct to have. So let's let Kanye just be a Christian before he's a celebrity, or an influencer for that matter.
What is your favorite track on the album and why?
I like God Is and Selah, and I won't consider myself adept to quote the lyrics myself over here on the radio. But just the language of there's a language, I believe, in God Is, where he talks about how Christ filled his cup. And the reason I like that language is because, and I put this on social media last week, is everyone comes to Christ and comes to their conversion through a particular narrative. So, Christ is the total Savior. He saves us in all capacities, but there are unique ways in which we come to know Christ. And I think that Kanye West is experiencing Christ as someone who gives him both rest and satisfaction, because it's clear from remarks he's made elsewhere that looking to money, sex, and power those had diminishing returns in his life. So he was looking for something deeper, something that would, living water, so to speak, as Jesus calls himself. And I think he's found that. Kanye has found that in Christ. And I just think that was a profoundly unique way that he's articulated his salvation experience.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
For most of the last half-century, struggles over the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution have largely revolved around the competing schools of, first, the living Constitution, associated with judicial activism and political liberalism, as opposed to originalism, associated with judicial restraint and political conservatism. But recently, the originalist school has undergone significant fissures, with some of its adherents supporting judicial engagement and rejecting the counsels of restraint. Because of this, people on both the left and the right in our constitutional politics support some form of judicial activism. On December 5 at the Acton Institute, Matthew J. Frank from Princeton University will be speaking on the rule of law versus the rule of judges. Save your seat today and view our full event calendar at acton.org/events.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, and I'm the librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. I am joined today by Stefan Kolev, Deputy Director of the Wilhelm Röpke Institute in Erfurt and Professor of Political Economy at the University of Applied Sciences in Zwickau. We'll be discussing the life and legacy of the German economist Wilhelm Röpke. Stefan, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
Ropke is not somebody who's well known in the English-speaking world, and in late November, Acton will be publishing an anthology of his own writings entitled The Humane Economist, a Wilhelm Röpke Reader. You've contributed a fine introduction to that. Stefan, who is Wilhelm Röpke, and how does his experience in life sort of shape his thought?
So to begin with, he's born in 1899, the same year Hayek was born, and a couple of other interesting economists on both sides of the Atlantic, what I call the fin de siècle generation. He had to fight the war, and then in the 1920s, he made a pretty stellar career in Germany. One of the very few youngsters back then who, as opposed to the historical school, who was doing largely theoretical analysis, really became an economic theorist. And he was extremely important as a public intellectual and as a theorist during the Great Depression, which of course hit Germany particularly badly in the early 30s, had some curious ideas about how to both diagnose and treat the Great Depression. But in 1933, an awful age began, and so he decided to emigrate. Some of his friends remained in Germany, but to him that was not an option, so he moved to Istanbul for 4 years and then was lucky in 1937 to get a position at Geneva, where he stayed for the rest of his life until 1966. And out of there, he was, again, both an important political economist and an important social philosopher for the difficult war years and for the post-war decades. Pretty formative for the German debates, for the German social market economy, for the early stages of European integration, but also as a public intellectual in newspapers, radio programs, and the like. So quite an intriguing figure. I hope the reader which the Acton Institute has produced will help to give him some new visibility.
When you make that distinction between Röpke as an economic thinker who's primarily a theorist, as opposed to the German historical school doing sort of just historical analysis of economic phenomena, in what way did that role as a theorist help him address issues of public policy in Germany and then also around the world?
So the historical school is a curious thing. I think we, unlike many historians of economics do, I don't think we should bash it too much, but there is an important distinction here. The historical school was in love with methodological, epistemological debates about methods, about normativity. But then in the 1920s, of course, after World War I had created that huge damage on the economic order, those debates were of not much use for the practical problems of the day, right? So Germany, of course, had the hyperinflation in the early 1920s, for which the historical school didn't have an answer because it didn't have a proper monetary theory. And then when the Great Depression hit in, you again needed a coherent business cycle theory to explain what was going on and to say what is to be done. So methodological inquiries or questions of normativity was not what the public was expecting from economists. And so in that respect, the young generation to which Röpke belonged back then really was better equipped. I wouldn't say perfectly equipped, but given their poor education in theory, they actually did quite a good job to both think what has to be done and to communicate it to the public. I think what is really important for Röpke especially is that he spent lots and lots and lots of his time and energy to persuade the citizen, the public, of what is to be done. Not in an elitist conception of politics where we try to convince some bureaucrats or politicians only, but really to try to reach out to the normal citizen and to explain what has to be done. So having a theory and having the willingness to explain that theory to the normal citizen as sort of a consultant to the citizen, as James Buchanan would say, was his understanding of what a political economist should do.
Could you give our audience some examples of some of those reforms that Röpke would have liked to have seen, many of which did come to pass, but the sort of reforms he advocated, both in his position as an academic economist and as sort of a public intellectual?
So I think that the Great Depression is a curious example. I mean, many people know the Austrian business cycle theory, to which Röpke basically subscribed, saying that once the boom is over, there is a recession, and the recession has some purification effects. He agreed about that, and so when the Great Depression hit in, he said the first thing government should do is wait for that purification process to take place. But then he said it might be that the depression has two phases, a primary phase and a secondary phase. And so the primary phase is this helpful phase of the purification where government should wait. But if a secondary phase hits in, which means that the depression starts to affect sectors of the economy which had not been affected by the boom, if it really turns into a mass psychology phenomenon of a real depression in the sense of a mental depression, then he said in that secondary phase of the depression, government should start using some expansionary tools so that the economy can be, as he would say, reignited, so to get an initial ignition so that prosperity can start again, which I think at the time was also quite important, not only for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. So he was hoping that the last Weimar cabinets in the early 1930s would show by such measures their both willingness and capability to do something, whereas the political order otherwise seemed quite defunct. So for the order liberals to whom Röpke belonged, this notion of interdependence of orders is extremely important. So here you can see that doing something in the economic order, meaning expansionary politics in the secondary phase of the depression, is not only important for economic reasons, but also quite important, or perhaps at least as important, for political reasons. So saving the political order by showing that it's able to act. And then once this political order has survived, one can again fine-tune the economy. Unfortunately, it didn't work out because many people didn't see it like he did it, but he really he took a position which was not only smart in terms of economics, but really prescient in terms of what unfortunately happened in terms of political developments, which he, with all his power, tried to prevent.
So there's the emphasis on sound economic policy, but also an acknowledgement that there is a world beyond economics, of politics, of social institutions, and that there may be times when it's appropriate to intervene to shore up those other institutions that are necessary for human and social life.
Precisely. So the economy is really an embedded entity, an embedded order within the larger order of society. So we should not be economists only. People know this quotation of Hayek that a good economist cannot be an economist who is only an economist. And actually he coins that phrase, to my knowledge at least, for the first time when he has some laudatory things to say about Röpke at his 60th birthday. So the economist should not be what Röpke would say economistic, so think only about the economic order, but always see the economic order as this interdependent entity embedded in society, so connected to politics, connected to the legal order, connected to the religious order, connected to the order of science, because otherwise we become, in a bad way, specialists. We need to specialize, but we need to be specialists with interfaces to those other societal orders and always think in those relationships.
And Ropke was excellent at that. He is, when you read him, it's amazing how well-read he is and how wide his knowledge in the humanities is. And in political theory, in legal theory, and in ethics, he really brings that to bear on all of the questions he addresses. He also has a strong emphasis on the sort of moral and religious framework that a society should have. Could you speak to how he addresses that, and that gets into sort of the humanities grounding as well, because it's there's an institutional place in the realm of religion with the church and in the realm of morals with the family, but he also sees the ideas as very, very essential as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like to put it like that. The order liberals, but also Hayek, were extremely worried about the rules of the game. So we play those games in the different orders of society, and so the question is, what are the good rules? But then Röpke asks an additional question. He says, okay, we can have great rules of the game, but then as we experienced in 1917 in Russia or in 1933 in Germany, the whole playing ground can crash, right? So the whole stadium on which that game is played with the good rules can actually break apart. And so his question is, what are the foundations of that stadium or of that playing ground on which we play the games of economy and society? And here it really comes to, as you said, to values, traditions, to institutions like the family, but also institutions of civil society, which sort of as a constant reservoir provide those foundations. He is skeptical, or pretty skeptical, that markets produce those foundations themselves. They don't. So the viability of those foundations, the stability of the foundations has to come from somewhere else. And this is where his, I would say, love for small units comes. So basically saying that it's small units of the family, the small units of a society which does not fall prey to massification, which enables people to, on a constant basis, live a moral life. And living that moral life will make them immune to the ideologies of the 19th and 20th century, which on quite a few occasions killed the free order. So that is how I see it. Really worried about the foundations of their playing ground and thinking about all those pillars which are necessary to stabilize it. The state is one of them, but not actually the essential one. The essential one is what we would call today informal institutions that are needed both on the individual level and on the group level, so that people persevere with all the tensions which modernity poses on us human beings. If we succeed with that, then the playing ground will be sustainable, and then we can play the games of modernity. If not, we can fall back into tribalisms of all kinds, as it happened in Germany in 1933.
There are some interesting places in his writings where he kind of pushes back on the Marxist class analysis of how proletarianization happens. And he views this as not merely a material struggle of capital and labor, but a struggle of values between a sort of bourgeois values of family, respect for private property, thrift, versus a proletarian sort of antagonistic attitude towards society, one that minimizes the value of private property, one that doesn't see debt as an extravagance. He sees this as a cultural struggle, and that is in that way the ideas or the leaders. You don't have markets emerge without the traditions of ethics, law, and economics in those institutions that arose in the place that they do and can foster those sorts of values and that sort of spirit of enterprise, competition, rule of law.
Absolutely. So proletarization is a term which he and his friends use, but as you said, not in the material sense, but in the spiritual sense. So if people spiritually become proletarians, that would mean that they get detached from the values which we discussed and become an easy target for those new anti-humanistic ideologies which are around. I think in that respect he can really be called a communitarian, right? So he's really, really worried that only small communities, be it the family or the small town or independent small enterprises, are able to embed the individual to sort of protect him from that mass character of modernity which he's worried about, and to, by that, also preserve the individual from becoming a prey of those dangerous ideologies and becoming a spiritual proletarian. Let me put it in that way. So I think it's interesting to contrast Hayek and Röpke here. So Hayek, of course, has this perennial anxiety that we have lived for many, many millennia in the logic of the small community, and so that logic of the small community can constantly threaten the logic of the extended order. And so that's what he's worried about. And Röpke is worried about the opposite. So how modern society, modern life of that extended order can actually harm the small community, which is so necessary so that people remain embedded and do not lose their roots and by that become susceptible or prone to this becoming spiritual proletarians. So he really is worried that as Hayek, we live in those two worlds, but Hayek is worried about the world of the community becoming a danger for the world of society, whereas Röpke is worried about the world of society harming that communitarian aspects which are so important to him to preserve the individual. And by the way, I think this is very important when we look at our world today. And globalization, as we have it, reinforces that logic of the extended order of society, whereas digitalization reinforces the logic of the community. So, and I'm really curious how those tensions which Hayek and Röpke see in the pre-digital world, how they will play out in our globalized and digitalized world of today. But the tensions quite certainly exist, right? So we do live in these two worlds, and each and every one of us has to cope with the tension of having these very different logics in us and coexisting in them.
When you extend that argument to an argument about a sort of globalization and a political and maybe in an economic sense, but a sort of a digital font of communities, could you unpack that a little bit? Because I think that's a fascinating argument.
So I see it like this. In our real life, in the sense of our, let's say, in our jobs, in our let's say in the life beyond the digital, right? So the way we just live. Globalization for many, many decades, or probably centuries and millennia, has unfolded the necessity to be ever more mobile, to learn languages which we wouldn't speak in the small community. So to open up to that wonderful thing which Adam Smith would call the Great Society, meaning millions or billions of people who interact with each other through trade, through today also investment and migration. So we have that. And globalization, of course, as we've had it in the last 150 years, has really reinforced that part of our coexistence, which could, and again, that was Röpke's main concern, kill or at least impair our life in the community, because if we move around all the time in our jobs and we switch locations all the time, it's quite difficult to be rooted in a community because you change the communities you live in on a constant basis. So I'm really curious, in a positive sense, to what extent digitalization will enable us to experience a sort of a comeback of the community. In the sense that I'm from Bulgaria, I live in Germany. Facebook and Skype have enabled me to connect back to my old Bulgarian friends and circles, which were lost for quite a few years. And so our real life can remain globalized, but our digital life enables us to get back to our communities, so that perhaps the tension of only living in a globalized world without too many roots can be sort of ameliorated by having the communities in our phone, right? It could work out nicely in the sense that we say, okay, now I can bear the life of the globalized great society better. But of course, it could also create the tension, right? That the two logics become into or get into an even greater tension than it was in the pre-digital world. But I'm an optimist. I think that, at least in my case, it has really worked out. So currently I'm in my sabbatical in the US, and because of those media, I don't feel so detached from my communities, neither in Germany nor in Bulgaria, as I would if the digital world did not exist. So it could be that those megatrends of our days make the tensions which Hayek and Ropke are so worried about perhaps a little bit easier to live with.
No, that is an amazing, and as you can see, is the thoughts of Ropke are very much alive and with us today, and can help us grapple with these questions of the intersection of society, institutions, technology. Stefan, thank you so much for being with us today, and introducing us to this important figure and giving us some very useful applications for his thought.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening today. If you want to learn more about the Acton Institute and what we do, check out our website at acton.org. That's acton.org. If you want to reach our podcast team here at Acton and let us know what you think of the show, you can email us at actonline@acton.org. Last but not least, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen.